I was about 12 or 13 years old. One time, when I'm walking to my psychiatrist for my weekly appointment. It's a half-hour walk and after dark. I enjoyed walking, especially after dark when things are quiet, peaceful and slow, and no one else around. No, I didn't live in a dangerous neighborhood, nor did my walk take me through any dangerous neighborhoods. As I'm about halfway to my destination, a car, a Cadillac, comes driving down the street. Some people, both male and female, in the car, are sticking themselves halfway out the windows and are taunting me and jeering me as they drive past. A bunch of people in their late teens or early 20s. I ignore them and keep walking. About a minute or two later, the same car comes down the street again, and those people are jeering me and taunting me yet again. I don't know who they are. Maybe they live in the neighborhood. I still ignore them and keep walking. Another minute or so goes by, and again they come driving down the street, taunting and jeering me. Now I'm worried. They're circling the block over and over, deliberately focusing on me. As soon as they reach the corner and make their turn and are out of sight, I ducked behind some bushes in someone's front yard and began waiting. The car comes down the street. This time, not seeing me walking down the street, they're not jeering. They pass right by me and my hiding place and turn the corner. I think they think I've finally reached my destination, one of the houses on the block, and went inside, and as a result, drove away. Sadly, I thought wrong. Stupidly, I leave my hiding place and go back to walking on my way to my psychiatrist. I should have stayed there, behind those bushes, much longer, because I can hear the car approaching. They spot me and start taunting and jeering me once again. And again, they turn the corner. This time, I begin running towards my destination, but I know I won't get far before the car and those crazy kids catch up with me again. So to that effect, I decided to hide again behind the bushes, in front of an apartment building. This time, I stay there for good until the thugs in the car give up their searching for me. I'm hiding there behind the bushes for not long, maybe about 30 seconds or so, when the guy whose apartment it is pops out from his apartment, asking what I'm doing hiding in his bushes. At first he probably thinks I'm a burglar or something, but I explain to him how I'm walking to my psychiatrist's office and how I'm being followed and harassed by a bunch of kids in a car, and this was the reason why I was hiding in his bushes. The guy can instantly tell from the tone of my voice and my facial expressions that I'm telling him the truth. He can see how scared I am. Just then, the car comes down the street and pulls right up the curb directly in front of us. They look at me and the guy I'm with. Not a mean-looking guy. He was in his late 30s, early 40s, but tough and serious-looking enough. He's not wearing a shirt, but he's wearing a sleeveless undershirt, which reveals that this guy's upper body is very well toned, slightly muscular, and no fat. I'm looking at the car, and I realise that it's missing a few people inside. The car doesn't look so full now. The guy I'm with just gives them a mean stare. He asks me, "Do you know them?" I explain that no, I don't know them at all. I haven't the slightest idea who they are. Just then, as the car is sitting there, about 3 of them approach, walking from the other direction. The car was travelling east to west. These 3 were walking on foot from west to east, so this explains why the car seemed not so full. They were looking to escalate the situation. They weren't satisfied with just driving by and taunting me. They had now changed tactics. A few of them got out of the car, up ahead, and started walking towards me, while the ones in the car took another turn around the block. Their plan now was to physically trap me in between themselves and the car, perhaps grab me and drag me into their car with them, for whatever reason. But seeing my tough guy guardian angel with me, the kids walking towards the car instead got into the car and they took off. The guy offered to stay with me for a little longer, or if I wanted to duck into his apartment to stay there until I was sure I would be safe to continue on my journey. I had a feeling that this was the last I was going to see of these guys and their car, and I didn't want to be late for my appointment, so I thanked the guy for his offer, but declined, and decided to head on my way. The guy went back into his apartment and closed the door. I looked at the closed door and hoped that I didn't make a mistake by turning down the guy's offer of better safety, because I was still scared. Thankfully, I was right about not seeing the car again. The rest of my walk, I was unmolested. I reached my psychiatrist's office. I told my therapist about what happened. He insisted on calling the police. The police came and took a report from me. That's the last I ever heard of this. On my way back home, I usually take the same route that I came from, up on the same streets. But this particular evening, I varied my way home, taking some different side streets to walk on. I never saw that car or those thugs again. Here is, via Google Street Search, the very spot I hid. That door was the guy's apartment. That grassy area behind the low black metal fence on the left was where the bushes were that I hid behind. Back when the bushes in that spot were very tall, wide and thick, enough to hide a 12 to 13-year-old kid behind. If I hadn't ducked behind those bushes, I would have walked right into their trap. And God knows what they had in store for me once they had me trapped.
So this is about 1986, and Friday the 13th Part 6 has been released. My parents were never big on monitoring what I watched as a child, so I'd seen all the movies to this point, knew the cha-cha-cha noise and big bloody axe as his staples. My scout troop is on an overnight retreat at some rec hall. I think it was attached to a church. My mom was a troop leader, and several other adults were there as chaperones. All us girls had fun that night, eating pizza and doing hair, trading charms from our Cracker Jack necklaces and such. We may have even watched a movie. Family friendly for obvious reasons. It was time to tuck in for the night. After we all fought about who would sleep next to whom, we got our sleeping bags laid out and our pajamas on. The chaperones allowed us one last run around the hall for squealing, pulling hair, getting drinks, or bathroom breaks. Since this was a rec hall, there was no coverings on the windows. At one point, during our last hoorah before bedtime, a group of us, myself included, saw some movement outside the window, which was in a hallway by the bathrooms. We huddled around the window looking, then about simultaneously shat and pissed ourselves. Jason Voorhees stood outside the window tapping with his axe. We screamed bloody murder. He disappeared. Chaperones came running, my mom included. They're confronted by a gasping, shrieking gavel of girls screaming, "The Friday the 13th guy is outside." They didn't believe us. We are all crying, and I'm really shaken up because I've seen these movies and I know what happens when Jason gets a hold of you. I guess when the chaperones saw we were still shook up after 5 to 10 minutes had passed, my mom pulled me aside and asked me if we were playing a prank on them or not. I swore up and down, left and right and sideways that no, we were not lying when we saw Jason. So the chaperones decided to go check out all the windows in the rec hall. They moved from one to another, and after a few minutes pass, I hear a woman cursing. Jason was standing outside the window she was looking out. By then, adults and children are thoroughly scared shitless. Us kids think real-life Jason is outside waiting to get his hands on us Girl Scouts. And the adults know that there's some pervert creeper outside dressed in a Jason Voorhees costume with an axe, who has been spying on little girls for an unknown length of time. Since these were the days before cell phones, my mom had to comb through the phone book at the payphone to find the right police station to call. She called, they sent someone out, but I guess Jason ran off at some point after an adult saw him. The police officer searched the perimeter of the church, looked around the outside of the rec hall, and did confirm that there were footprints in the dirt at the rec hall windows. Each window had a little bush and paving stones making a little horseshoe, so footprints would be easily seen in the dirt there. We never had another overnight retreat after that, and I hung up my Girl Scout uniform. I have no idea if they ever caught that pervert creeper. I'm guessing not, since I never heard anything more about it from my mom. I have also not watched any more Friday the 13th movies since that day.
I used to live at a small farm in the U.S. growing up, but as soon as I was 18, I moved out instantly, and I'll tell you why. When I was 12, me and my best friend Zach, who lived down the road, used to go in the woods to play, since we lived in the country, and there was almost nothing to do. We would always explore and pretend to be treasure hunters. I always used to take my dad's old cowboy hat, and Zach would take his small shovel every day. But if it was a bad day, we would just play some games on the Nintendo 64. This happened like 13 years ago, so it was the best you could get. We would always go a bit deeper in the forest every time we went in. We usually managed to find something interesting in the woods, like old coins, water bottles, some nice-looking stones, and some other things. Yeah, I know, really lame stuff. But we were kids at the time, and we always thought of it as treasure. I had a small box under my bed to put the things I found in, and so did Zach. We had an awesome childhood, but some creepy shit started happening over some time. One day while we were exploring the forest again, we came across a well. We got really excited, thinking we actually found something good. We checked it out, but there was nothing special and the well was dry. We pretty much got our hopes up for nothing. We headed back home and another day was over. The next day was a Friday, and when we got back home from school, Zach went back to his house and I went back to mine. Not long after having lunch, Zach was at the door. I grabbed my dad's hat and opened the door, and when I opened it, Zach was there with two other boys. They were much bigger than me and Zach. Zach introduced them as his cousins, saying they were staying with his mom and dad for the weekend. Their names were Danny and Simon. They were both 15, 3 years older than me and Zach. They wanted to come with me and Zach into the woods. I agreed, so we went there. It was just a normal day for the most part, but Zach's cousins were total assholes, saying it sucked being in the woods, and asking us how we never got bored out there. Later that night, around 11 at night, I got knocks at my bedroom window. It was Zach and his cousins. They told me to come down. I managed to get downstairs without awakening my parents. I opened the door and the cousins asked me if I wanted to go to the woods. I'd never been out there at night before, and to be honest, I didn't want to go, and I told them that. Then they said, "Your loss." They went off in the direction of the tree line. I changed my mind, grabbed my dad's hat, and ran after them. I caught up to them, and we started to walk deeper in the woods. I was scared shitless, and by the look on Zach's face, he was scared as well. The cousins stayed in front, shining their flashlights on the spooky trees. I noticed we were going in the direction of the well. I know the place like the back of my hand, so I had a plan in case shit hit the fan. We were coming up on the well. Suddenly the cousins stopped and turned off their flashlights. We asked them what was wrong. They stood still like statues. Then we went around them, since we stayed behind them, and I froze as well. There was a person standing in front of the well, not looking in our direction, thankfully. I stood there like a statue, not knowing what to do. Then one of the cousins, I think it was Simon, whispered, "Turn around slowly and walk away. Slowly, don't make any sudden moves." I complied, and we all turned around and started walking back slowly so that figure wouldn't notice us. Then the terrible happened. I stood on a stick by accident and made it snap. It was loud and we weren't far enough away from that figure, so we all stopped again. I looked back and the figure was now looking at us. I almost fainted with fear. Then Danny screamed, "Run!" We all floored it. I dropped my hat while running back, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I had no idea if the figure was following us, since all of our footsteps made it hard to make out. I didn't look back either, so I didn't know. We all managed to make it back safely. I ran into my house and slammed the door shut. My parents were awake and I got shouted at by my parents, and I was grounded for a week. But they also looked really relieved. My mom hugged me and said, "I'm glad you're safe." I was confused and asked them what they were so worried about. Then they told me something that made me even more scared. They told me that recently an escaped killer was on the loose, and he was just spotted in our area. And when my dad saw that I wasn't in my room, since he would usually check up on me, and the front door wasn't shut, they thought I had been kidnapped, and they were about to call the police when I came through the door. After hearing that, I started crying. My parents asked me why. I told them what had happened. Their faces were full of horror after telling them that. They called the police and immediately, later on, they arrived. I explained everything to them. They said they would take a look in the woods, and they did. A half hour later, they came back with nothing. but they said that the next day they would bring more cops to search the area some more, and warned me not to go back into the woods again, and I obliged. I could barely sleep that night because I was so afraid that the man would come for me. The next day, more cops came to our farm and started investigating the woods. They also went to Zach's house. My mom came in and said she found my dad's hat on the doorstep. I remembered that last night. I had dropped it. How did it get there? I thought about some more, and the man in the woods came to mind. I started panicking again. My parents calmed me down and asked me what was wrong. I told them about the hat. They had nervous looks on their faces. My dad took the hat to a cop outside. I managed to calm down again, and for the rest of the day, I just played video games since my parents grounded me. Around lunchtime, we got a knock at the door. I answered it. It was Zach and his mom. Zach's mom asked if she could talk to my parents. I told my parents they were at the door. Then they told us to go into my room and play something. I put my ear against the door and listened. Zach's mom told my parents that Danny wasn't in the house in the morning, and after hearing the news about the creep in the woods, she began to worry. One thing didn't make sense, though. All four of us made it out safely. I was confused. Then Zach told me something that scared the living shit out of me. He said Danny had left the house when they got back. He left while Simon and Zach were sleeping, although Zach wasn't asleep. Zach said he looked out the window and saw him walk into the woods. He wanted to stop him, but he said he was so scared to go out there again. He never came back. I asked him why he left. Zach didn't know. Then Simon came over to hang out later on. I asked him if he knew why Danny left the house. He said he had no idea. Danny always used to carry around his dead mother's ring with him, since his mom had died a year prior to the events of the story. He always used to keep it in a box, and he would take it wherever he would go. Simon checked the box in the morning, and it was empty. He must have dropped it while we were running from that guy last night, he said. After that day, as weeks went by, the guy in the woods was never caught. The cops started an investigation on Danny's disappearance. He was also never found, and Zach and I never went back in the woods again. Once we reached 18, we bought a house between each other and became roommates. Nothing's better than having a roommate as your best friend. I'm 25 now, I live with my girlfriend, and I still hang out with Zach. But even after all that time, I still think about that night every day, and I probably will for the rest of my life.
Here's some backstory. I live in a smaller side of the city, in Estonia. I won't tell in which part because of obvious reasons, and there aren't many people living in the side of the city that I live in, so it's pretty quiet here, and nothing strange usually happens. I'm a 13-year-old boy who loves to listen to creepy true stories. Okay, now, to my story. It's 2 p.m. and I just finished another boring school day, so I have guitar lessons on Wednesdays after school, and the lessons last from 1 to 2.5 hours. I started walking from my school to a shop nearby. I bought a can of soda, left the shop, and headed to the guitar lesson. On my way there, I was a bit late for the bus, so I booked it and ran to get there on time. I made it, and I was currently happy that my running skills actually came in handy for once. But the happiness didn't last for long, seeing as had I forgotten my notes for the song that I had to play in front of the whole class. Fuck, I said in my head, and I was so pissed off for forgetting such an important thing. I tried remembering all of the chords in my head, but I couldn't remember anything. A, E, D, fuck, why am I so dumb? My guitar teacher is going to be such a dick about it as well. I was even thinking about skipping the lesson and going back home and lied to my parents that my teacher was sick and that there was no lesson happening today. But I decided to man up and went to the lesson anyway. That was the first bad idea. It started raining as soon as I got off the bus, so I put my hood on all the way up. I got to the entrance of my guitar school and I spotted a weird, 6 foot tall, I'm guessing homeless guy, wearing a red hoodie jacket, just sitting in a puddle. I thought it was weird at first, and then I saw that he wasn't even moving. He was just sitting in the middle of the street, and it felt like he was paralyzed, or even dead. I watched him for about 5 minutes, and he didn't move once. I got a very unnerving feeling and stepped into the classroom. I quickly forgot about the man and started playing my guitar. After 2.5 hours of sitting in that warm and sweaty classroom, we were finally free and went outside. And to my surprise, the man was still sitting there, and he hadn't moved a fucking muscle. I was creeped out again, and I took a photo to send to my friends. I have since deleted the photo because I had to change phones. The bad thing was that I had to get some stuff at a gardening shop for my mom, and the guy was sitting directly in front of the store. Oh no, he's gonna grab me and do something with me, I thought, but I was paranoid because I had just listened to Corpse Husband's video of 5 creepy let's not meet stories, and thought I was going to be one of the victims. But when I finally had the courage to go past him and into the store, nothing happened. I was so relieved that he didn't just grab my leg and try to drag me away. But then again, why would anyone do that? Especially in front of a store that was packed with people and in bright daylight. It was just in my head, and I was a very paranoid person. So I bought some garden stuff for my mom and got out of there because I was tired and wanted to go home and take a big nap. But as soon as I passed the guy, he got up and started walking behind me. I was so freaked out that I didn't want to glance back to see what he looked like. I just had the thought of, oh, no worries. He just got tired at the exact same time that I passed him, and now he is walking in the same direction as I am. What a coincidence. I got to the bus and stopped, and you guessed it, Mr. Sitting in a Puddle guy was standing right next to me and staring at me. Yup, you heard it right. He was staring directly into my eyes, and I could see from the corner of my left eye. I didn't want to look at him, so I kept staring forward. In a couple of minutes, my bus came. I entered first, and the puddle man came in right after me. I have to mention this. He smelled like he had been living in a garbage can for the last month, and I think he actually had been. I walked to the end of the bus, where there weren't many people, and thus there were many free seats. And of course, the guy sat right next to me. I didn't want to switch seats, so I bared his disgusting odor. I was getting a bit unnerved, because he wouldn't stop staring at me, and he was breathing through his mouth, down my neck. I could feel and smell the stretch of rotten egg coming from his mouth. Fucking disgusting. When I got to my stop, it was already dark out, so it made me more scared than I already was. I sat at the window seat and stood up to let him know that I wanted to get off, but he wasn't getting the hint. So I said, "Excuse me, I would like to leave. May you please get up? Or at least move your legs, so I could get off the bus." He didn't even flinch. I thought he didn't understand Estonian. So I said it again, but now in Russian. No answer, and he didn't move his legs or his body. He just kept staring at me, and now I saw his face. He had brown eyes and a long, dirty beard. It was covered with cheese or something like that. He had a baseball cap that had many holes in it, and a sweaty and muddy Lakers t-shirt. I basically jumped over him so I could get out. Bear in mind, I had a long and heavy guitar on my back, so it was kinda difficult to navigate. And when I got off the bus, the guy got off as well. This fucking guy didn't move when he clearly knew that I wanted to get off the bus, and now he just started following me again. Luckily, my apartment was very close to the bus stop, so I literally ran for my life to the door, and when I looked back towards him, he was running at me like a maniac. Luckily, we have a door that closes automatically when shut, so I got the door open and closed at the right time, because the second it closed, he was at the door banging on it and screaming some incoherent things at me. I ran straight upstairs to my apartment door, which was on the 4th floor. I was basically bawling my eyes out, right there and then. My mom was at home preparing dinner for my family. I told her everything. She ran to the window that overlooked the house door and saw nobody, obviously. But the scary part is that when my dad came home, he said he saw a guy in a red hooded jacket with a baseball cap on, standing on the 3rd floor and knocking on different doors, asking for me by name. My dad asked him what the fuck he was doing, and he ran down the stairs and out the door. Thank God my dad came home when he did, because if he had gone 1 story higher, he would have knocked on our door. My questions are, how the fuck did he get inside? And how in the fuck did he know my name? He must have been stalking me somehow, or asked my friends, neighbors, or family members for my name. So, to the homeless guy that stalked me, and somehow knew my name, let's never meet again.
So I randomly found this subreddit, and after reading the first few top posts of all time, I instantly knew what story I should post here. As the title suggests, I was on a school trip. It was senior year, and our high school has a senior trip every year. Other schools have these too, I'm sure. My whole class, a whopping 23 students, started fundraising at the start of the 8th grade year. Living in a remote town in Northern California, we decided as a class to go down to LA for a week. We decided to go see Venice Beach, Universal Studios, and other LA attractions. We stayed in a hostel right on Venice Beach. We got 2 rooms to ourselves, a boys' room and a girls' room. I got to stay in the girls' room because all the beds were taken in the boys' room. Me being the 275, 6 foot tall motherfucker I am, whenever anyone wanted to go out to walk around, I would walk with them. And this is where things take a bad turn. One of the girls wanted to go out, so she asked me to come along. I agreed and went with her. Walking down the sidewalk next to the beach, her phone rang. It was her other friend wanting to chat, so she went to go talk to her. I sat down on a bench while she talked. I could still see her, of course, but she was far enough to be out of earshot. There are few people around because it's LA, and there are always people around. There was a man stumbling about, tattoos out the ass. I have nothing against tattoos, trust me, I'm just describing him. He was scrawny and tall. He started yelling about how just because someone is in a club, that doesn't mean someone has a bigger dick. I was very confused, and sure I'm missing most of the story. He walked towards a couple that were at a table, and they said something and he walked away. Away from them, towards me. I instantly tensed up, because I have almost zero fighting experience, and was not ready to deal with a drunk guy. He locked eyes with me, walked up to me, turned so that he was perpendicular to the way I was facing, and pulled out a knife. I froze. Well, it wasn't really a knife. It was one of those X-Acto knives used in art and shit. I don't even know what they're used for. I did not care about the type of blade, just very aware that it would hurt if jammed into my neck. The girl was walking back by this time and saw him pull the knife. I looked at her, and she started to walk towards the hostel, which was no more than 2 minutes away. He then proceeds to hold out his arm. This is when I noticed the track marks on his arm. He was a junkie. I instantly started thinking about what my final words should be. But instead of saying anything to me, he looks down at his hand. He starts mumbling about something. I was too freaked out to worry about the semantics of a heroin ramble. He takes the knife and starts cutting the top of his hand. I can see the blood pour out at the first slice. My heart is no longer felt anywhere on my person. I stop breathing. My brain remembers that I do in fact have working legs. I get up and walk away toward the hostel. I get to the front door, and there is the girl on her way down with the chaperones. They stop me and ask if I'm okay. I tell them what happened and that I wasn't hurt and everything's good. I go up to the boys' room to hang out and recount the story. They're all stoned and talking about getting a pizza. I figure a pizza sounds good, so I order a pizza. The pizza was, in fact, good.
This is my first time posting, and this is by far the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. This all took place around 2 years ago. I was 17 at the time, living in northern England. For some background, my mother was a single mother because my dad had left before I was born. She works very hard, and in the whole 17 years leading up to this point, it was always just me and her, and she never had a boyfriend or anything like that. But just before my 17th birthday, this is what happened. It wasn't long before Christmas when my mother told me that she was speaking to one of her old friends from school on Facebook, and she was going to ask him to come around for some food and drink and catch up. At this point, I had no male role model in my life whatsoever, so I can't say I wasn't a little excited myself that my mother had finally met someone after so long. On the day he came around, I was out most of the night because my mother had bought me 2 tickets to see 50 Cent for me and a friend as an early Christmas present, so we went and stayed over after. This is when I first made contact with the man I'll call Dan, so he stands up, shakes my hand, and tells me he's heard a lot about me. And all seems good. He even bought us food and convinced my mom to give me another early Christmas present, so I liked him already. If only I knew then what I know now. So now you're all caught up. That happened around November, so fast forward to January, which is when my birthday is, and I was turning 17. Now that this dad has already started to feel a bit weird to me because he had already moved into my house, but I just thought he might have been struggling, even though he always went on that he worked offshore on the oil rigs and had 3 houses that are all up for rent. So you would expect him to have a fair bit of cash, but he never seemed to have any. So anyway, my 17th birthday comes and I ask my mom if I can have a party, just messing with her because it was obvious she'd say no. And she did, but then Dan overhears and convinces her to let me, and so they both stay so it wouldn't get out of hand. So I invite all my friends over and we're having a good time. I'm really starting to like Dan, even though I had only known him for a short period of time. He seemed to understand what it's like to be my age. So the party's going good, everyone's enjoying it, then Dan sits in the front of the room with us. This is where it started to get a little off. I'm the funny one in my friendship group, so I made my friends laugh quite a bit, and Dan didn't really seem to like it. I don't really know what he was thinking, but he started to talk to all my friends as if he were competing with me and belittling me at every chance he got. I thought it was a little weird, but I had never had a father figure before, so I thought he was just joking. But as the night went on, it got weirder. He came up to me later and pulled out a tiny bag of cocaine inside and offered me some. Being 17, if your mom's boyfriend is offering you coke in front of your friends, that has to be the coolest thing in the world. So I had some. He then said to me, "Don't tell your mom, or I'll get into shit." And I agreed. I wouldn't, believe me. I'd be in a lot more shit than he would if I told her. So anyway, Dan got more drunk, and then started to like my friends more than I did. And made a comment to one of my friend's girlfriends, who was 16 and he was in his late 30s, asking if she wanted to go upstairs. And she said no, and came up to me asking what the fuck his problem was. And I shook it off, again, saying he'll just be messing around. So the party's over, and it's a few days later, and Dan is acting really weird. Not to my face, but behind my back. For example, my mom would ask me to wash the dishes or clean my room, and Dan would say, "Don't worry about it, just leave them. You go out and I'll do it." So I said thanks and went out. When I'd come home, the dishes wouldn't be done and my room would be a mess. So I'd get into shit for it. It was just stupid things like this that began making me start thinking. This is where the worst part comes in. My mom and Dan are going out drinking for the night. My mom never normally drinks, but I assume she's just going because he wanted to. So I invited my girlfriend over to stay the night. While they were gone, we ordered food, watched movies, and fell asleep. We were then awoken by my mom screaming, "No, Dan, please don't!" and Dan's screaming at her saying, "I'll kill you and your fucking son." So I told my girlfriend wait in bed, and I gave her a small metal pole from my weight set to defend herself in case anything happened. Then I proceeded downstairs. When I got downstairs, it was crazy. There was a hole straight through my TV, the glass cabinet had been smashed, and Dan had my mother by her arms, screaming in her face that she's no good and loads of other horrible things. So I shout, "Get the fuck off her!" They both freeze and then calm down, and straight away he says, "I didn't hit her. Did you really think I'd do that?" In the calmest voice ever. So I did what any mature teenager would do and punched that cunt straight in the nose. But obviously he has muscles bigger than my waist. I'm not the biggest of mammals to populate this planet. So he just tackles me to the floor and punches me. Then all of a sudden, someone bangs on the door. But they didn't stop to see if anyone would answer it. It was just repeated until Dan answered the door. My next door neighbor was there with a pole in his hand, and he said, "Have you been fucking hitting her?" And Dan is extremely calm again and says, "What are you talking about?" I then stand in the doorway behind him bleeding from my nose and nod. My next door neighbor then drags him outside and they both start fighting on my front garden. And Dan had been hit by the pole, so he was bleeding from his head and had blood pouring down his face. The police then arrived. My neighbor obviously called them before he started swinging poles around, which was a smart move. Dan was then arrested and my neighbor also got taken to court. My mom stuck up for Dan. She was obviously just scared, so I made a statement to the police because God only knows what he would have done if my neighbor didn't come. So Dan's now in jail. There's no story about it as proof, but I'm just hoping that you'll believe it. The weirdest part about it all is that me and my mom talked about it a few months later, and she said he never had any money. He didn't have 3 houses. He lived with his mom, and he lied about it all. He was just living off me the whole time, and he had spent a lot of money. So for a while, we thought we'd have to sell the house. My mom's a fighter, though, so she worked her butt off to pay all the debts owed and keep the house, but she also said, "He told me you took cocaine and refused to do things he asked," which I denied at the time, but she knows the truth now that I'm older. But even though I took it, I can't help but think that he was trying to get in between me and my mom to bring us down, when in fact, it only made us closer. She's fine now, and we still live in the same house. I asked her about why he hit her, and she said, "He said I slept with one of your friends at your party," which was quite funny because my mom wasn't even there, but it just shows how crazy he was. My mom is now with a different man who is one of the nicest people I've ever met, and Dan is married to another woman he was cheating on my mom with the entire time. God help that woman. Dan, let's never ever meet again.
Okay, this is my first official post on here, but I have to share this story. It happened about 3 years ago. I live in the United States. I was a 6'1", 210 pounds, 23-year-old white male college student that was living in a predominantly Hispanic, low-income neighborhood when this occurred. About 5 minutes after my Pizza Hut shift one night, I decided to walk across the street to buy a couple of tall boys at my local liquor store, excited about it being the weekend and getting to sleep in the next morning. I know, I had no life. So, as a cashier was handing me my bag of booze, across the counter, a muffled, yet short, female scream, the cashier and I made that certain eye contact where you're both just like, what the fuck? After a brief silence, he just shrugs his shoulders slowly and tells me to be careful getting home. I nodded my head and start out after giving him a gracias from over my shoulder. I know it seems like we have underreacted, but honestly, you see and hear a lot of crazy shit in this city, especially at night. So in addition to not wanting to get mixed up in something, you just don't call the cops over anything, especially a random scream. Even with that being said, thinking about how pitiful it sounded gave me a mixture of disgust, anger, and cold fear. My heart speeding up at this point, I opened the liquor store door slightly and looked around outside. After hearing and seeing nothing but traffic for about 15 seconds, I decide to start walking home. Head down, eyes and ears open, but as soon as I round the liquor store corner, I was greeted by an obviously intoxicated, but somehow steady, short, stocky Hispanic man with a scratched up face and really stretched out shirt. Assuming he was one of the few drunks that live in a small but dense patch of forest about 12 feet behind the store, I completely disregarded him and continued walking. At first, something about his behavior caught my attention. He looked extremely nervous and as if he were up to something, and I could hear a faint, almost non-existing, gurgle-like sound coming from the trees. Immediately, I began to suspect he had something to do with the scream I'd heard just a few minutes ago. Upon making eye contact, he caught on fast that I suspected him. "Está bien?" Spanish for "how are you?" He awkwardly asked me, smiling way too much, and motioning for me to follow him into the darkness behind the store. I pretty much told him to fuck off and continued walking home at a much faster pace now, looking behind me every 16 or so steps. I began wondering what the hell that noise was coming from in the woods, and why the man was acting so shady. Maybe I was overreacting though. Maybe the sound was just an old pipe or drain nearby. Maybe he really was just drunk and didn't want me to call the cops on him for public intoxication or something. I now wish everything within me I would have called the police then and there, and went into the store and waited. About 5 minutes later, while walking down the particular dark and isolated stretch of road about a half a mile before my apartment, out of fucking nowhere, the man I just seen burst through some shrubbery about 12 feet from me on my back left, wielding a fucking machete. That's right, a fucking machete. Honestly, you can't make this shit up. I immediately went into panic mode and threw my beer at him and began running as fast as my legs would carry me toward my apartment building, hoping I had enough strength left within me to make it. I now realize I should have ran back toward the store, as it was closer, but as I started, he came from behind me, and the rest is instinct. He was initially so close behind me, I swear I could hear the blade cutting the air as he swung at me from behind. I honestly expected a machete blow to the neck or head at any second. That's a very unequal, very hard state of mind to be in, knowing that you could die at any moment. The worst, most gruesome thoughts of being murdered began to fill my head. Would I trip, only to have a defensive arm hacked off right before my eyes? Or would I be halfway decapitated, mid-stride, falling hard and bleeding out as other parts of my body were cut away? Tears began to fill my eyes at the thought of my family would feel knowing I was hacked to death, bleeding out on the side of a dark road, alone. I began to scream, half out of desperation to live, the other half out of fear of not wanting to die such a horrible death. I know it sounds bitchy, but you can't really judge until you're being chased down by someone who literally wants to hack apart your body until you die. I'll try to shorten the story a little now. Yes, I eventually made it home. Some part of me knew I'd lost the guy way before getting there, but my fear and adrenaline refused to let me stop running. I collapsed as soon as I made it inside and tried to focus on not going into cardiac arrest for not only running so hard, but out of fear of my life. I tried to remember everything I learned in the Army about 2-mile recovery drill. It helped a little. Anyone who's been even in a remotely similar situation can understand why I never called the police. After much needed water and heavy breathing, it was 30 minutes before I could even put a chain of complete, rational thoughts together due to the shock and mental, physical exhaustion caused by what just happened. By which time the guy would be long gone. I remember all I could think about was how the hell I didn't hear him getting that close to me after 5 whole minutes of walking. Especially with him being under the influence and me being sober. Needless to say, after double checking all the doors and windows, I fell into a paranoid sleep, grabbing a kitchen knife soon after. The next day, I came to find that young teenage girl had been raped and killed behind that same store around the time I had been leaving the previous night. Her throat had been slit and her body dumped not far where she'd been raped. Every person that lived behind the store was tested against the semen found inside the girl's body, and not a one was matched. As far as I know, the guy has never been caught. I'm 120% sure that the scratched face and stretched shirt on the man I'd seen the previous night were remnants of the poor girl's futile attempt to fight off her rapist and killer, and that the suspicion he saw on my face was enough for him to want to kill me, as he must have thought I was a witness or something. The mother of the child had only sent her there to buy some orange juice for something she'd been making for dinner that night. The liquor store was the closest carrier of the OJ in that area. I can't help but kind of feel guilty though. And I feel so horrible for the girl's family, especially the mother. If I'd called the police then and there and went back inside, would he have been caught? I remind myself that things played out the way they did, and that I can't change the past. The worst part, though, is thinking that the gurgling sound I'd heard was a girl trying to breathe, despite choking on her own blood. Mere yards from me. I'm almost certain this is true. Also, who the fuck just carries around a damn machete? Is that what he used to cut the girl's throat? Nevertheless, Michael Myers, machete-wielding rapist. Let's never meet ever again.
This happened a couple of years ago, during the first semester of my sophomore year at college. Being a female in college trains you to become sensitive to potentially sticky situations, especially when you're a frequent partier. I was 19 at the time, and had already had my fair share of creepy experiences with men. Although most of the time, they were at most very uncomfortable situations at parties or bars, I had never yet had an encounter that made me genuinely fear for my life, and I always felt that I could get away safely without having to deal with having any further contact with the individual. I consider myself a woman with good gut instinct. Another important thing to mention before getting into my story is that at the time, I was a bit eccentric. To shorten a very long story, I was still in active addiction and almost completely off my rocker during this time, which reflected in my appearance. I had lavender-coloured hair, several facial piercings, and would dress like a walking acid trip. I also used to hula hoop all the time for fun. I still do on occasion, but not so often anymore, and had a few friends who did as well. When the weather was nice, we would meet up at night on the weekends and practice together. Amongst other things, I would often be treated negatively because of my appearance. A handful of times, psychiatrists accused me of drug seeking during my diagnostic appointments while trying to get treatment for anxiety and depression. And when it was late at night, It wasn't uncommon for me to be stopped by the police and questioned about my activities. At this point, it didn't surprise me anymore when something like that would happen, and I had developed a piss-poor attitude against cops. The university I attended is huge. We have about 60,000 students and 4 campuses, which are decently spread out one from another. The campuses are integrated into the city that it's located in. Generally speaking, the city is an absolute shithole, but the areas closest to campus, although not that much nicer in appearance, are generally a lot safer. A good amount of students live in this off-campus housing area. We have a very extensive bus system, so that in theory, students can easily travel between campuses in order to get around. But the buses do not travel into off-campus territory, so if you want to get to somewhere around, you have to walk to your destination from the bus stop. That night I decided to meet up with one of my friends to hoop. We both had class until late that night, so we agreed to meet around 9 p.m. at her place. She lived in a house off campus, about a mile away from the closest bus stop. The route was shaped like an L. The bus stop was at the very top of the L. The walk to the corner was about 3/4 of a mile, followed by a right turn and another 1/4 of a mile walk to the end of the street. The first part of the walk wasn't notorious for being bad, but her street could get a little bit sketchy at times. It's also worth mentioning that about a block away from her bus stop en route to her house, there is a pretty large hospital. So I took the bus as far as I could, and once I ended up at the closest stop, I began walking to her place. I put in my headphones, and with my hula hoop in hand, I began my trek. I thought nothing about the walk. I spent the entire time daydreaming and jamming out to my music. The street was well lit, and there was nobody else out. So that combined with the familiarity of the route made me feel indifferent. Everything was absolutely normal. But then, about halfway down the first portion of my walk, I noticed a police car drive by me. It was one of those undercover cars, as opposed to a clearly marked vehicle. But it was still obviously a police car. As with a lot of people, my senses heighten when there are police present. I didn't freak out or anything, but it was noted. I continued along with my walk, and about a block later, I noticed the same police car pass me by again. This time, coming from the opposite direction, and moving a bit slower. This made me very irritated. I was tired of being harassed by police officers, but this particular night, I also had something in my bag which could have potentially gotten me in trouble with the law. So anxiety began to set in on top of the irritation. I really did not want to deal with something like this. The officer didn't stop me, and eventually passed by me and turned into the next street. So I decided that picking up the pace, but not at a suspicious rate, would probably be for the best. I made it down to my friend's street and turned onto it. I was thankful that the longest part of the walk was now over, and that I only had about 5 more minutes of being on high alert until I was home free. I got maybe a block and a half down when I saw the cop car for the 3rd time, coming my way, passing by me even slower than it had the last time. At this point, I was starting to feel extremely anxious, praying to a god that I didn't believe in to please get this officer away from me. I was almost in tears, scenarios featuring the worst possible outcome of this situation, involving arrest, getting kicked out of school, and my parents dubbing me the family embarrassment and disowning me, were playing in my mind. I was on the verge of an anxiety attack. At this point, I could see my friend's house, and picked up the pace just a little bit more. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made it to her house. She always used the side entrance, which was located at the end of her driveway, about 30 feet long. It was actually more like a small parking lot, since the property was a very large house split into several apartments. Just as I began to walk up her driveway, the cop car came speeding down the street and pulled into the driveway after me. This is it, I thought to myself. I was prepared for the worst to happen, but knew that if I played it cool, I would most likely be okay. The cop didn't get out of his car, but rolled his window down instead. I took my headphones out and turned my attention to him. "Good evening, ma'am," he said in a kind and concerned voice. "I just wanted to know, are you okay right now?" Huh? What a weird question. Definitely not what I was expecting. "Yeah, I'm totally fine," I replied. "Just planning on hanging out with a friend tonight. I'm coming from my campus, and this is her house. Why do you ask?" The officer looked at me with a look of concern in his eyes. "Well, we got a call from someone who was sitting outside of the emergency room at the hospital. They phoned in to inform us that someone was following you down Arlington Street from the moment in time that you were in front of the hospital." This confused me, for not once had there been any sort of indication that I was being followed. "No, sir, I'm fine. I didn't notice anything suspicious, and nobody has approached me." Immediately after I said this, a man jumped out of a large bush on the side of my friend's house, about 7 feet away from where I was standing. He looked to be about 40 to 50 years old, tall, lanky, and was dressed in old dirty clothing. He was looking right at me with a seriously sinister look in his eyes, smiling ear to ear. In his hand there was a large hunting knife. He turned to me and started to cackle, while stretching out both of his arms, fully exposing his knife. "Come on, baby. Why'd you have to call your boyfriend on me like this? All I wanted was to ask you for a cigarette." Then right in front of the police officer, he began to approach me. I didn't pay attention to what the cop did to handle the situation, because I immediately sprinted down the driveway to my friend's door and began to pound as loudly as I could. She must have been in the living room because she answered the door fairly quickly. I bolted inside, hyperventilating and shaking. She looked outside, and there were now 4 cop cars in the driveway. Naturally, she was extremely concerned and confused, and asked me what the hell had just happened. I explained to her the situation, and she was horrified. After the police handled it, they knocked on the door to make sure I was unharmed. They didn't know who he was because he had no identification on him, but it was very likely based on how he looked and where he was psychologically that he was one of the many homeless men around here. They took him away, and I never heard anything about it again. The man must have been extremely sick, as he had the audacity to approach me with a knife directly in front of a police officer. I shudder at the thought of what could have happened to me if a good Samaritan hadn't listened to their gut instinct and called for help. The first thing I did when I got home that night was order pepper spray off Amazon with 2-day shipping. I never walk around when it's dark with my headphones anymore, and I always consciously note things that seem off about my surroundings as I walk. Even if you think you have an intuitive gut, never grow complacent and always stay on the lookout. I am definitely grateful for that officer, and have since had a serious change of heart regarding my prejudice against the police. As a side note, this was extremely stupid of me to do in the first place, and I obviously never learned my lesson, but I reiterate, never walk around when it's dark with both headphones in. This situation may have been prevented if I didn't do this.
This happened to me and my sister back in 2008. We're from the Netherlands, in a little village, I guess you can say, called Wiesenhof, which is part of the city Nijmegen. There's a circular path in the woods section of our neighborhood. So, kind of an outline here. Our backyard faced a pond. You had to walk along the pond around 2 or 3 minutes before you'd enter the woods, and right away there was a path, which would go in a large circle within the woods. Usually people took their dogs out there, or just jogging, or, the typical everyday stuff. It was absolutely beautiful though. Me and my family always took our dogs out into the forest. The circle took around 20 to 30 minutes to walk, so it was perfect for a good length exercise for us. Okay, now that you guys kind of have a vision, I'll start the story. I was around 10 at the time, and my sister was 14. She decided to take out our dogs and asked me to come along. I didn't really have much to do, so I said sure. So we were walking the normal path. We had a small dog and a big dog. I was holding the big dog, whose name was Jip, taken from a Dutch children's story, and he was the typical alpha male dog who always wanted to be up front. Our smaller dog, whose name was Evie, was typically very calm and always liked taking her time, so she was sniffing on spots for a good length of time. Jip was getting particularly anxious and wanted to keep on walking, so he was pulling me. Being 10 at the time, he had quite a lot of force. So I told my sister I'd be a bit further up while she let Evie finish up her sniffing spree. My sister was fine with that. We live in a super safe area. Just your typical Western European village. No troublemakers around. Just a super clean-cut area, so we never assumed anything could go wrong. It just never occurred to us. While I had turned the corner of the 4-pointed forest path, I looked back and saw Evie was still profusely sniffing, so I walked a bit further, out of sight of my sister. Not even a minute later, my sister came quite frantically around the corner, hurrying Evie along with her, and told me to continue walking. I saw the fear in her face, and I did as I was told. The way home she was dead silent, not saying anything. I was of course very scared, and didn't know how to react, so I was just keeping up with her pace. Jip also helped with that. But once we made it home, I asked her what happened, and she said she saw a man dressed up as a mime staring at her from behind a tree, and that she tried to act like she didn't notice. But her facial expression must have given her away, as when she started walking, the mime started following her. Not on the path though, but systematically behind each tree. She swore every time she looked back he was behind the next tree. Apparently, when she turned the corner, she didn't see him anymore. I didn't really know what to think. I had felt bad I had gone further with Jip, but my 10-year-old mind didn't really assume that anything could go wrong in such a safe place, which is why I came across as even more of a shock. My sister hasn't said anything about it since that day, but she knew for certain she saw a man dressed as a mime. It didn't seem to affect her too much afterwards, luckily, but it must have been quite a scare knowing that I wasn't in sight and knowing some freak dressed up as a mime was following her. Luckily, nothing else happened, and we have since moved. So, Creepy Woods Mime? Let's not meet.
I've been following this sub for ages, and finally figured it was time for me to share what is one of my most messed up encounters. This is my first post on Reddit, and I've never been a great writer, so apologies if it's a bit of a slow read. But this is without a doubt the creepiest experience of my life. Bit of info about myself. Currently 22-year-old male. I've lived in a medium to large-sized town not too far from London for most of my life. This story took place about 12 years ago when I was 10 years old, and actually took place in County Galway on the west coast of Ireland. This is where most of my family originates, through my grandparents, and lots of my aunts, uncles, and cousins still live over there. Unfortunately, this story starts the day after we buried my grandfather. The decision was made to bury him in Galway, despite the fact that he'd lived in England for the past 58 years of his life, which I thought was slightly odd, but it was also influenced by pretty strict religious, social traditions among Irish people. I come from a pretty big family, and despite it being a sad occasion, it was pretty cool to have all of our family gathered together like this. For people who might be unfamiliar with Ireland, or in this case, its west coast, it's not the most pleasant place to be in all honesty. They get all the crap weather fresh from the Atlantic Ocean, so it's pretty much raining all year round. This story takes place in the winter months, where it's pretty much 24/7 downpours and regular gale force winds. Despite Ireland being a very small country in relation to places like the US or Australia, where I know a lot of posters of this subreddit originate. In areas like this, you could drive for hours and hours, barely seeing any signs of civilization other than people's homes, which would be spread out along the side of the road, normally about 100 to 200 meters apart. A lot of these houses would be poorly kept, so much so that it made me wonder if they were even inhabited anymore. This might not sound particularly bad to a lot of people, but as a kid who'd grown up in a relatively lively city-style environment, the dreariness and isolation of this place made me feel creeped the hell out, even before the story had really started. So, at the first event of the story, the funeral had taken place the day before. A lot of people had said their goodbyes and gone back home. We were staying at an aunt's house, which was a fairly large house that her husband had built when they moved from England to Ireland about 5 years before. So it was a pretty modern setup, compared with most of the rundown houses that you found in this area of the country. My parents decided to drop it on me today, that we would be staying for 4 days longer than we had originally planned. In hindsight, I think it was because my aunt was still having a hard time with my grandfather being gone. It's also rare that my parents really get away from home, or get the chance to spend time with family. My first thoughts were, oh great, more time stuck in this shit heap. But I reluctantly accepted it since it meant more time away from school, which I wasn't really enjoying at that age. It's nighttime at this point, around 9 p.m. I'm by myself in the living room, which is at the front of the house, sort of passing out on the sofa watching Shallow Hal. Typical Irish weather smashing against the window. The wind was howling so much that the stronger gusts would make the house shudder. The rest of my family were in the kitchen dining room socializing and drinking, despite the hangover most of them still have from the after-funeral drinking sessions the previous night. To describe the layout of the house a bit more, in front of the house was a long driveway that stretched about 50 meters toward a gate which connected to a bumpy, poorly kept road that led to a lot of other houses in the area, most of which were spread out about 200 meters away from each other, so walking to even the closest neighbor took some effort. The house had a driveway that extended around the side of the house, so people could park their cars behind the house, the side where the kitchen was, and then enter through the back door. As a car would approach the house, you could hear them crunching the gravel under their tires, and there was a sensory light at the front which would switch on, so you'd notice when somebody was approaching. Except on this occasion, the pattern was a bit different. I couldn't hear any sort of movement outside the house. Even with the gale force winds, I could normally hear the loud grinding of gravel under tires. It was enough to wake us up at night when somebody came from the pub in the early hours. I could see the lights come on through the closed curtains. I initially just looked at the closed curtains and thought it was a bit peculiar, but didn't set off any kind of alarm bells yet. The lights outside slowly dimmed and then went off completely. It was dark again, until just a few seconds later the lights came back on again, only to slowly dim and switch off again moments later, still with no sound of cars coming from outside. After this happened for a fourth time, my curiosity got the better of me, and I went over, opened the curtain, and glanced out. Just as I approached the curtains, the lights dimmed and went out again. So by the time I glanced out, I was just peering into darkness at first. After a few seconds, the light came on again, and I just remember getting the fright of my life, like a jump scare from a horror movie. Only a few meters from the window, there was an elderly woman, wearing nothing but a white nightgown and a pair of white trainers, standing on the front lawn in some of the most extreme weather Ireland has to offer. It must have been near freezing temperature outside. Moments after the light came on, she spotted me glancing out the window and looked at me. Even now I struggle to describe the look on her face. It was hard to make out, like a strange mixture between fear, anger, and a euphoria, like she could feel pain, but was enjoying it somehow. And her face was constantly flinching as the powerful raindrops hit her face, and this made her look all the more hard to interpret. At the time, after the initial jump scare style reveal of the old woman, I wouldn't say I felt fear. She was just an old woman who was around the same size, if not smaller than me, but I was still well and truly creeped the fuck out. We were in the middle of nowhere, and this woman had appeared as if from thin air, and there was something quite clearly wrong with her. All I could really think to do was leave the window and walk back to my family in the kitchen and tell them, there's a fucking old woman outside the front of the house. Initially they looked at me in kind of a what the fuck way for a few seconds, before my uncle, my mom's brother, shot up from his chair and pointed out the kitchen window at the back of our house, basically saying, whoa, what? In the fairly short space of about 20 seconds since I left the front window, she had made her way around the side of the house and was now staring at us all through the window. At this point, in a strange way, the situation took an almost comical turn, as my aunt, whose house we were in, stood up and said, "Oh, for fuck's sake, not again." As she stood up, put her coat on, and grabbed her keys, leaving through the back door right next to where the woman was. We all just looked at her in confusion, as if to say, "Again? You mean this has happened before?" We watched out the window as she talked with the woman and eventually brought her inside her car and drove away with her. After she'd left, her husband explained to us that this old woman lived down the road from them, and that she suffered from severe dementia. Amazingly, where this woman lived was over a kilometer away from where we were, meaning that a woman who must have been well of her 80s, wearing only a nightgown and a pair of trainers, in near freezing temperatures, rain and gale force winds, had somehow managed to wander over 1,000 meters and eventually end up in our front garden. Seriously, Irish women are beasts. I got thoroughly freaked out when my aunt's husband told us about an incident that had happened about 6 weeks beforehand. She lives with her son, who is her caregiver, and frequently breaks out of the house and goes wandering. Most of the people in the area were okay with this because they figured she wasn't doing any harm, until one day she managed to get inside a dog kennel that one of the locals had in their back garden. She picked up a jagged piece of metal from the person's garage, and for some reason decided to stab one of the huskies they had inside the kennel, killing it. Oh, great. So now I know that this woman is potentially dangerous and wandering aimlessly around an area as if this dreary landscape couldn't get any creepier. But that's not the worst part of the story. The next evening I was in the house. This time it was only me and my older cousin, who was 17 or 18 at the time, as everyone else had gone down to the pub about 5 kilometers away. Me and my cousin weren't really in the mood, so we stayed in watching TV. It was getting late. We were watching The Fugitive, but I was struggling to keep my eyes open, so I got myself into a comfortable position and dozed off for a while. I woke up not knowing what time it was, to complete silence. I was alone. The TV was off and my cousin was gone. Even the weather was uncharacteristically silent on this occasion. I couldn't even hear any rain. I got up from the sofa and stood up. I was barefoot at the time, and the first thing I realized as my feet hit the floor was that it was extremely cold. Even considering the weather outside, the house had powerful heating that was on pretty much round the clock. I guess someone must have left a window open, or maybe that back door was open for some reason. I walked out of the living room and turned facing towards the back of the house, with the door to the kitchen on my left and the stairs on my right. As I stood in the hallway, I could feel wind blowing against my bare feet. This wasn't just a bit of a draft. I knew the back door was open. I instantly got the infamous feeling described in so many Let's Not Meet stories. The feeling that something was wrong, that someone was there with me. This was a totally different feeling to the previous night. The feeling of being creeped out had developed into feeling completely in danger and completely isolated and by myself. Where the fuck could my cousin have gone? The kitchen light was off at the time, so the only thing I could see was whatever was illuminated by the ceiling light of the hallway I was standing in. That was until, to my confusion, I saw some small, flashing, multicolored lights in the kitchen, moving at floor level, slowly from the direction of the back door towards where I was. While I was so focused on the lights, I should have been focusing above them, because as they moved closer, I could see the nightgown, and as she got even closer, I could see the rainwater dripping onto the tiled kitchen floor, which just helped to reflect the flashing lights in her trainers, as well as my impending doom. After I clogged on and came to my senses, realizing what was in front of me, I launched myself towards the stairs. And I mean actually launched. My feet didn't touch the floor of the hallway. I did a crazy run crawl up the stairs and locked myself in the room that me and my brother had been sharing during our stay. A slightly odd detail about this house, and really convenient for this situation, was that almost every door in the house had peepholes instead of just the front door. Never got round to asking my aunt why this was. So I was stood, glued to the peephole, peering out of the hallway. In the rush, I really wish I had thought to turn the light on in the upstairs hallway. Luckily, the peephole had a full view of the stairs, so I could see whoever may come up them. At this point, it's still complete silence. No wind, no rain, only my heavy breathing, muffled by my face being pressed against the door so hard. The view of the hallway was motionless, for long enough that I almost started to think I'd hallucinated the whole thing. There was nobody actually out there. Eventually I could see her face. She made her way slowly up the stairs before stopping near the top. Her position meant that I could only see the top half of her body, from the waist up, and that was enough, because just that much of her was making my heart pound. The view from the peephole was fairly poor, but I could just about make out her facial expression. It was empty, emotionless, almost vegetable-like. Her mouth was hanging open, which gave her almost zombie-like appearance. Then the groans started. For a second, I thought it was the creaking of floorboards or the house setting, but it gradually got louder and louder. It was a dull, emotionless which would drag out for 4 or 5 seconds before stopping, completely monotone, but somehow with enough impact and emotion to make my whole body shiver and shake. I don't actually know how long I was standing there listening to her, but eventually she started slowly moving back down the stairs, the groans growing more and more silent as she moved away. I still didn't fucking move from the door until I heard the sound of gravel crunching under tires. Turns out my cousin had left after I fell asleep to go pick up my drunk family from the pub, leaving the door unlocked in the process. As soon as they pulled the car behind the back of the house, they were concerned, since the back door was wide open, and they found muddy footprints and pools of water on the kitchen floor. I'm guessing in hindsight that her family, carer, got her trainers with the flashing lights on the side to make her more visible in darkness, in case she ever wandered at night. Whoever's idea it was, thank you, because who the fuck knows what would have happened if I would have wandered into that kitchen without being able to see her coming towards me. The weird thing is, looking back at this, I don't think I even felt physically threatened by this woman. Despite being only 10, I was a fairly large kid, and in one of my physical struggle, I probably could have overpowered her, if it had even come to that. I think that my fear came from the fact that in my idiotic 10-year-old mind, waking up to find my cousin gone and this woman in my kitchen, I felt like something supernatural was happening, like she was some sort of ghost or banshee. Stupid, I know, but that's how my mind worked back then. I remember even being in Dublin waiting for the ferry over to Wales, constantly looking over my shoulder, even though this woman was on the other side of the country at this point, like she was just gonna appear randomly and stab me like she did that poor husky. As I grew older, though, I think I looked quite differently at the whole thing. My grandmother is currently suffering from dementia, and I've worked with dementia patients part-time while at university. This event was a pretty early sign in my life that dementia is no fucking joke, and people with dementia, especially severe cases, need real 24-hour care so that they're not a danger to themselves or others around them. The fact that this woman was allowed to wander aimlessly through the freezing Irish countryside into God knows whose house to do God knows what makes me wonder if her family or the health services even cared about looking after her at all. Now that I look back at it, I think it's more of a sad story than a creepy story, at least from my perspective. Also, Brendan, if you're reading this, fuck you for leaving the back door unlocked.